The white-haired man stood at the counter like a ghost from another century, and Maya Patterson knew, with the kind of instinct that prickled at the base of her spine, that something about him was wrong in a way that made her hands shake as she gripped the espresso portafilter. He had visited exactly once before, on a Tuesday evening when the rain had been particularly vicious and the café particularly empty, and he had sat in the corner booth for 3 hours, nursing a single black coffee while she worked through her closing duties. Maya remembered him because it was impossible not to. That bone-white hair falling past his shoulders, the kind of pale skin that looked like it had never seen sunlight, and eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the dim café lighting whole. He'd left a $100 bill for a $4 coffee and disappeared into the rain before she could offer change. Now, 7 days later, he stood before her again during the afternoon rush, and before Maya could summon her customer service voice to ask what he wanted, he spoke in a voice like velvet dragged over stone. Double shot of espresso, half an ounce of vanilla syrup, the real kind, not the standard pump-steamed oat milk to exactly 140 degrees, finished with cinnamon and a single star anise pod balanced on the foam. His eyes met hers, and something in them looked almost uncertain, as though he had surprised himself. "That is correct, yes?" Maya's mouth went dry. That was her drink, the absurdly specific concoction she made herself during slow shifts, the one she had prepared exactly once during his previous visit while he sat in that corner booth watching the rain. She had never written it down, had never mentioned it, had made it quickly, privately, while he stared out the window at something she couldn't see. "How did you—" she started, but the words tangled in her throat. "I remember." He said it simply, but there was something raw beneath the statement, something that sounded like confusion or perhaps wonder. "May I order one? For you?" The question jolted her back into the present, into the hiss of the espresso machine and the chatter of students huddled over laptops at rain-streaked windows. The café, called the Sanctuary, occupied a converted basement space in the University District of Seattle, all exposed brick and warm Edison bulbs fighting back the perpetual gray drizzle outside. Maya had worked here for 2 years while finishing her literature degree, and in that time she had served thousands of customers. None of them had ever memorized her off-menu experiment after watching her make it once. "I'm working," she managed, but her coworker Sienna was already waving her off. "Take your break," Sienna said, eyeing the stranger with obvious appreciation. "I've got the rush." Maya found herself nodding, watching as the man she realized she didn't even know his name moved to the corner booth, the same one he had occupied before. She made the drink with trembling hands, hyper-aware of his gaze on her movements, and when she carried both cups to his table, her own order and a black coffee for him, he stood until she sat down. The gesture was old-fashioned in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. "I'm Theron," he said as he settled back into his seat. "Theron Ravencourt. And I realize I've unsettled you, which was not my intention." Maya. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, needing something to anchor her. "And yes, it's a little unsettling when a stranger memorizes your complicated coffee order after seeing you make it one time." She paused, studying him. "Why did you remember it?" Theron was silent for a long moment, his long fingers wrapped around his own cup, and Maya noticed that his hands were steady while hers still shook slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost vulnerable in a way that seemed to cost him something. I don't know." The admission clearly troubled him. "I haven't remembered something so trivial in longer than you can imagine. Details like that stopped mattering to me a very long time ago." His dark eyes lifted to hers, and there was something almost desperate in them. "But I remembered yours, every measurement, every specific instruction you murmured to yourself, the way you smiled when you tasted it, and it came out exactly right." Maya should have been frightened. Every rational instinct told her to make an excuse, to leave, to avoid this strange man who watched her with eyes that had seen too much. But there was something in his voice, in the way he seemed genuinely bewildered by his own actions, that kept her seated. "Why does it bother you?" she asked. "That you remembered?" "Because I chose not to care about such things." He said it with a finality that suggested the choice had been deliberate, calculated. "And now I find that I do care, and I don't understand why." They talked until her break ended, and then beyond it, Sienna covering for her with increasingly obvious glances and a grin that promised later interrogation. Theron asked questions about her studies, Victorian literature, she told him, with a focus on Gothic fiction, and something about the topic made his mouth curve in what might have been amusement or sadness or both. He knew the books she mentioned, knew them with the kind of intimate detail that suggested multiple readings across years, and when he quoted Carmilla from memory, his accent shifted into something older, something that belonged to the era when the novel was first written. "You talk like you were there," Maya said, half joking, and Theron's expression shuddered so completely that she knew somehow that she had struck closer to truth than she meant to. "Perhaps I'm simply well-read," he offered, but the deflection was gentle, not dismissive. When the café finally closed at 10, the rain still hammering against the windows, Theron walked her to her bus stop despite her protests. He moved with a predator's grace, she noticed, and the shadows seemed to part for him in a way that shadows shouldn't. At the covered bench, he paused and Maya saw him struggle with something before he spoke. "May I come back?" he asked. "To see you again?" "You don't need permission to visit a café," Maya said, but she smiled when she said it, and Theron's answering expression was so relieved it made her chest ache. "Tomorrow, then." He stepped back into the rain, and Maya watched as he disappeared into the darkness between streetlights, moving faster than anyone should be able to move, and she finally allowed herself to think the word that had been circling her mind all evening: impossible. The next 3 weeks formed a pattern that became the architecture of Maya's days. Theron arrived every afternoon at 4, ordered black coffee he barely touched, and stayed until closing. They talked about books and history and art, conversations that sprawled across centuries of human culture, with Theron offering insights that grew increasingly difficult to explain away as mere scholarship. He never ate anything. He never arrived before dusk, and his skin remained that impossible porcelain white, luminous in the café's warm light. Maya knew what he was. Her Gothic literature studies had covered vampire mythology extensively, but knowing and believing were different territories, and she found herself trapped between them. It was easier to pretend, to enjoy his company, to ignore the way her pulse jumped when he smiled, or the protective way he positioned himself between her and any customer who grew too loud or aggressive. It was Sienna who finally forced the conversation, cornering Maya in the storage room during a quiet Tuesday afternoon. "So when are you going to admit you're dating a vampire?" Sienna asked, casual as discussing the weather. Maya nearly dropped the bag of coffee beans she was holding. "What? Oh, please." Sienna rolled her eyes. "Deathly pale, never eats or drinks anything, only shows up after sunset. Looks like he stepped out of an Anne Rice novel. I've seen Twilight. I know the signs." She paused, her expression turning more serious. "But also, the way he looks at you is kind of intense, like you're the only person in the world. It's either really romantic or really concerning, and I'm still deciding which." "He's just," Maya started, then stopped, because what was Theron exactly? "He's a friend. A friend who memorized your ridiculous coffee order and shows up every single day to stare at you with puppy dog eyes." Sienna shook her head. "If he's a vampire, that's fine, I guess. Unconventional. But if he's just a really weird rich guy with a sun allergy, that might actually be more concerning." The conversation haunted Maya through her shift, and when Theron arrived at his usual time, settling into his usual booth, she made a decision. She prepared 2 drinks, her complicated order, and his black coffee, and sat down across from him before he could protest about her working. "We need to talk," she said, and Theron's expression immediately grew wary. That particular phrase rarely precedes pleasant conversation. "What are you?" Maya asked bluntly, and watched his careful composure crack. Theron was silent for a long time, his dark eyes searching her face for something, fear, perhaps, or rejection. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and it trembled in a way she had never heard before. "You know what I am. I can see that you know." He leaned back, his pale hands spread flat on the scarred wooden table between them. "The question is whether you can accept it." "Say it anyway," Maya pressed. "I need to hear you say it." "I'm a vampire." The words fell between them like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Maya had been trying to rationalize. "I'm 643 years old. I've been the vampire king of the Pacific Northwest Territory for the last 3 centuries, ruling a court of 40 immortals from the tunnels beneath this city. He gestured vaguely downward. Beneath this café, actually, the old pneumatic mail system from the early 1900s connects to a much older network. We've been here longer than Seattle has been called Seattle. Maya's hands tightened around her cup. Why tell me? Why risk? Because you deserve the truth. Theron's voice was fierce now, urgent. Because for the first time in 600 years, I care enough about someone to want them to know the truth of what I am, and that terrifies me more than you can possibly understand. Why? Maya asked. Why me? Why now? Theron stood abruptly, pacing to the window, his reflection absent in the rain-streaked glass, another detail Maya should have noticed earlier. When he spoke again, his back was to her, his voice heavy with centuries of weight. I had my capacity for attachment deliberately diminished, he said. 250 years ago, I loved someone so completely that losing her nearly destroyed me. Not physically, vampires are difficult to destroy, but in every way that matters. I became dangerous, reckless, a threat to my court and everyone in it. So I went to a very old vampire in Prague, one who practices blood magic, and I asked her to dull my ability to care, to feel deeply, to remember the small details that make someone an individual rather than just another face in an endless parade of mortal lives. He turned back to face her, and Maya saw real fear in his eyes for the first time. It worked. For 2.5 centuries, I've been an effective king and a terrible person. I rule fairly but without compassion. I protect my territory but don't care about the individuals within it. I've watched the world change and felt nothing more than mild interest. And then you made yourself a complicated coffee drink on a rainy Tuesday evening, smiled when it came out right, and somehow that smile broke through 250 years of carefully constructed numbness. Maya's throat was tight. You're saying remembering my coffee order meant the spell is cracking. Theron moved back to the table but didn't sit, his movements agitated in a way that seemed foreign to his usual grace. It meant I'm starting to feel again, to care, to notice, and my court has realized this, and they're terrified. Why would they be terrified of you caring? Maya asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Because a king who doesn't care makes rational decisions. A king who cares becomes vulnerable, and vulnerability in our world is often fatal. He finally sat, reaching across the table to hover his hand near hers, not quite touching, asking permission. There's a faction in my court led by a vampire named Casimir, who believe my numbness has been good for stability. They want to preserve it. They've been meeting in secret, discussing options. Options for what? For ensuring I don't fully wake up from the spell. Theron's jaw tightened, either by reinforcing it or by removing the catalyst. Maya pulled her hand back. The catalyst being me. Yes. The café suddenly felt smaller, the shadows in the corners deeper. Maya looked at Theron, this impossibly old, impossibly dangerous creature who had somehow fixated on her and tried to organize her thoughts into something coherent. Fear should have been the dominant emotion, but it wasn't. Instead, she felt an odd anger on his behalf, a fierce protectiveness toward this vampire who had chosen numbness over pain and was now being punished for starting to heal. What do you want? She asked. Not what your court wants. What do you want? Theron looked at her with such raw longing that it hurt to witness. I want to feel again. Fully. Even if it means risking that kind of pain again. I want to remember things that matter. I want... He stopped, swallowed hard. I want to know what it's like to care about you without magical interference, to know if what I'm beginning to feel is real or just the spell breaking. Then break it, Maya said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. Find that vampire in Prague or whoever can undo it and break it completely. It's not that simple. Theron shook his head. Fully breaking the spell could be dangerous. The emotions I've suppressed for 2.5 centuries would return all at once, the grief, the rage, everything I couldn't handle the first time. It could make me unstable, violent. So you're trapped, Maya said slowly, between numbness and potential destruction. And both outcomes leave you in danger. Theron's voice was bitter. If I stay numb, Casimir's faction will eliminate you to preserve the status quo. If I break the spell, I might become something you need protection from. The only logical solution is for me to leave, to never come back to this cafe, to let you return to your normal life." "And is that what you want?" Maya challenged. No, the word was torn from him. God help me. No, I want to be selfish. I want to keep coming here, keep talking to you, keep learning everything about you. I want to know your favorite book and why you chose Victorian literature and what you want to do after graduation. I want to memorize not just your coffee order, but the way you tuck your hair behind your ear when you're concentrating and the specific shade of brown your eyes turn in lamplight. He stood again, agitated. I want to court you properly, the way I would have done centuries ago when such things had structure and meaning. But wanting doesn't make it right. Maya stood too, moving around the table until she was close enough to feel the unnatural cold that radiated from his skin. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and she saw him tense, saw him fight the instinct to step away or step closer, locked in indecision. "Here's what I think," she said. "I think you're giving Casimir and his faction too much power. I think you're assuming I'm helpless, which is fairly insulting. And I think 250 years of not feeling is enough." She took a breath. "Break the spell, deal with what comes, and let me help you." "You can't," Theron started, but Maya cut him off. "I can and I will. You said your court is beneath this cafe, right? In the old tunnels?" When he nodded, she continued. "Then they're on my territory as much as I'm on yours. This cafe, this space, it's been neutral ground. Let's keep it that way. Let's make it official." Something sparked in Theron's eyes. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of strategic thinking. A declared neutral ground would require agreement from the full court, not just my authority. It would require a gathering, a vote. Then gather them. Maya's heart was pounding, but her voice stayed steady. "Invite them up here, into the cafe. Let them meet me. Let them see I'm not some fragile thing that's going to break you." Maya. Her name on his lips was half prayer, half warning. "They'll try to frighten you. Casimir especially. He's nearly as old as I am, and far less." He paused, searching for the word. "Civilized." "I've read Dracula," Maya said dryly. "I think I can handle some posturing." Despite everything, Theron smiled, and it transformed his face from marble beauty to something warm and genuine and heartbreakingly human. "You're either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both." Maya returned to her side of the table, her barista mask sliding back into place even as her hands shook. "Set it up, make it happen. And Theron?" She waited until he looked at her. "After this is settled, after the spell is broken and your court is dealt with, you're taking me to dinner. A real date. Somewhere nice." "You're asking me on a date while planning to confront a vampire court?" Theron's voice held wonder. "I'm efficient." Maya picked up their cups. "Now get out of here. I have to close the cafe and then I need to go home and figure out what one wears to negotiate with immortals." Theron moved toward the door, then paused, turning back. "Maya, thank you for not running, for," he gestured helplessly, "for caring enough to fight. You memorized my coffee order," Maya said simply. "That deserves something." After he left, Maya finished closing alone, Sienna having departed earlier in the evening. As she wiped down tables and stacked chairs, she tried to process everything that had happened. She was either about to do something incredibly brave or suicidally stupid, and she wouldn't know which until she was standing in a room full of vampires. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Tomorrow night, midnight. Close the cafe early. I'll make sure you're safe." Maya saved the number and typed back, "I'll bake cookies. Even vampires should have refreshments at a meeting." His response came quickly. "You're going to give Casimir an aneurysm. I'm looking forward to it." Despite everything, Maya fell asleep that night with a smile on her face. The next evening arrived with characteristic Seattle rain, a steady downpour that turned the streets into rivers of reflected neon and made the sanctuary feel like an island of warmth in a dark sea. Maya had closed at 10 as instructed, sent Sienna home with vague explanations about a private event, and spent the last 2 hours baking chocolate chip cookies and trying not to panic. She had chosen her outfit carefully: dark jeans, a deep green sweater, boots with good traction. Practical, but put together. Clothing that said she took this seriously, but wasn't trying to impress. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she'd forgone makeup, except for a touch of mascara. When she looked in the cafe's bathroom mirror, she saw a woman who looked far calmer than she felt. Theron arrived at midnight, and Maya's breath caught despite herself. He was dressed formally in a black suit that looked like it cost more than her entire wardrobe, his white hair pulled back with a leather tie, and he moved with the contained power of a storm about to break. But when he saw her, his expression softened. "You wore green," he said. "It's perfect with your eyes." "You're allowed to compliment me after we survive this," Maya said, though warmth flooded through her. "How many are coming?" "The full court, 40 vampires, including Casimir and his primary supporters." Theron moved to help her arrange chairs in a loose circle, the cafe's usual intimate setup transformed into something more formal. "I've declared this a peaceful gathering on neutral ground. Violence here would violate the oldest of our laws. That doesn't mean there won't be threats, intimidation, or political maneuvering." "Will they drink the coffee I've prepared?" Maya had spent an hour crafting 4 different premium blends, unsure of vampire preferences. "Some will, to be polite. We can consume food and drink, it just doesn't sustain us." Theron paused, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. "Maya, you can still back out of this. I can declare the neutral ground myself without requiring—" "I'm not backing out." Maya covered his cold hand with her warm one. "We're doing this together." At precisely midnight, the floor behind the counter began to shift. A section of the old brick wall swung inward, revealing a passage that descended into darkness, lit by what looked like gaslight. Maya watched as vampires began to emerge. They were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Each one had that same bone-white skin and hair that ranged from pure white to silver to the palest gold. Their eyes were dark like Theron's, or red like fresh blood, or occasionally a disturbing pale blue that seemed to glow from within. They dressed in everything from medieval finery to modern fashion, and they moved with a predator's grace that made Maya's hindbrain scream warnings. But she stood her ground, positioned beside Theron at the center of the café, and met their curious, calculating, or hostile gazes with what she hoped was calm dignity. The last vampire to emerge was clearly Casimir. He was shorter than Theron, but broader, built like a warrior from an age when physical combat was constant. His white hair was cropped close to his skull, and his eyes were that unsettling pale blue. He wore modern clothing, dark slacks, and a burgundy dress shirt, but carried himself like a medieval lord. When his gaze landed on Maya, his lip curled in obvious disdain. "So this is the mortal disrupting our king's peace," Casimir said, his accent placing him somewhere in Eastern Europe centuries ago. "She's smaller than I expected." "Size is a poor measure of capability," Maya replied before Theron could speak, keeping her voice level. "As I'm sure you learned over your very long life." Several vampires made sounds that might have been surprised laughter. Casimir's expression darkened, but he moved to take a seat in the circle, and the others followed suit. Maya noticed that they divided into clear factions, some sitting near Casimir, others near Theron, and a significant number claiming the middle ground. Theron remained standing, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made Maya understand how he had ruled for 300 years. "We gathered to discuss 2 connected matters," he announced. "First, the establishment of this café, the sanctuary, as formal neutral ground between our court and the mortal world above. Second, my intention to break the suppression spell I have maintained for 2.5 centuries, and the implications for our territory." The café erupted in overlapping voices, protests, questions, exclamations of shock. Theron let it continue for exactly 10 seconds before he raised one hand, and silence fell instantly. "Casimir," Theron said, "as you lead the opposition to both measures, speak first." Casimir stood with deliberate slowness, his pale eyes scanning the assembled vampires before landing back on Maya. "Our king proposes to make himself vulnerable because of a mortal woman who caught his attention." His voice dripped scorn. "He would undo the very protection that has kept him stable and effective for centuries. He would elevate a human to significance within our world, creating a weakness our enemies could exploit. And he calls this progress." "I call it healing," Theron said quietly, but with steel beneath the words. I call it choosing to live rather than merely exist. And I call it recognizing that my so-called stability has been purchased at the cost of my humanity, the very thing that makes me capable of understanding the mortals we coexist with. We don't coexist, Casimir spat. We rule. We are apex predators who have granted the herd permission to graze in our territory. Caring about individual sheep is not strength, it's delusion. Maya felt rage flare hot and bright in her chest. She stepped forward, ignoring Theron's warning hand on her arm. Is that what you think? She asked Casimir. That I'm a sheep? That Theron caring about me makes him weak? She looked around the circle, meeting vampire eyes that had seen centuries, and forced herself not to flinch. Here's what I see. I see 40 immortals hiding in tunnels beneath the city, clinging to old hierarchies and older fears because change terrifies you. I see a man, yes, I'm calling him that, who survived losing someone he loved so much that the grief nearly destroyed him, and instead of processing that pain like a healthy being, he chose to cut off his ability to feel it all. She turned back to Casimir. And I see you, so afraid of what a feeling king might mean that you'd rather keep him in magical stasis than let him grow. The silence that followed was absolute. Maya could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 40 predatory gazes, and knew that she had either just earned their respect or signed her death warrant. It was a female vampire with silver hair braided to her waist who spoke first, her voice melodious and ancient. The girl has teeth. I like her. She's reckless, Casimir growled, but some of his supporters were nodding thoughtfully. She's brave, the female vampire countered, and she makes a valid point. Theron, you were insufferable after Isolde's death. You were also insufferable after you dulled yourself. Perhaps being insufferable while actually feeling something would be an improvement. She smiled, showing fangs. I vote yes to both measures. Other vampires began to speak, the conversation evolving into a complex debate about territory politics, emotional stability, and the nature of power. Maya listened, learning the court's dynamics through their arguments. Casimir commanded perhaps a dozen loyalists, vampires who valued tradition and distance from the mortal world. But many others seemed curious, even excited, about Theron's proposal. It was a younger vampire, though still probably older than America, who asked the crucial question, what if breaking the spell makes you dangerous? What if you become what you were after Isolde died? Theron was quiet for a long moment before answering. Then Maya has permission to stake me. The café erupted in chaos. Maya grabbed Theron's arm, spinning him to face her. What are you talking about? I mean it. Theron's dark eyes were clear, determined. If breaking the spell makes me a threat to you or anyone else, you'll end me. I'll tell you where I'm vulnerable, how to do it quickly. I trust you to make that choice if necessary. I'm not killing you, Maya said flatly. Find another contingency plan. There isn't one that ensures your safety. Then we'll figure one out together. Maya turned to face the assembled court, her hand still on Theron's arm. Here's my counter-proposal. Yes, establish this café as neutral ground. It's good for everyone to have a space where mortal and vampire can interact safely. Yes, Theron breaks the spell. But we do it here, in this space, with the full court present. If he becomes unstable, you have the numbers to restrain him without killing him until the initial surge of emotion passes. The silver-haired vampire who had spoken earlier leaned forward. You'd trust us to restrain him safely? To not use the opportunity to eliminate a temporarily weakened king? I'd trust your self-interest, Maya said. From what I've heard tonight, most of you don't actually want Casimir in charge. Theron's been a stable, fair ruler, even with diminished emotions. A Theron who can feel fully and has learned to process those feelings healthily would be even better. That's worth protecting. Casimir stood abruptly. This is absurd. We're debating the whims of a mortal girl who has offered a reasonable solution to a complex problem, another vampire interrupted, this one male with military bearing, and who has more courage than you're giving her credit for. I also vote yes to both measures, with the girl's modification to the process. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous, but it was decisive. 32 in favor, 8 opposed. Casimir and his closest supporters voted against, but even some of his previous allies had been swayed. The neutral ground was established first, with formal words and what looked like blood magic, several elder vampires pricking their thumbs and letting drops of blood fall onto the cafe's threshold while speaking in a language Maya didn't recognize. "The ground is sanctified," the silver-haired vampire announced. She introduced herself to Maya as Seraphine, second eldest in the court. "No violence may occur here without breaking the oldest laws. It will hold as long as the building stands." "Thank you," Maya said, meaning it. "Don't thank me yet, girl." Seraphine's smile was sharp. "Now comes the difficult part. Breaking the spell required contacting the vampire in Prague, a creature named Marana who practiced blood magic so old and dark that even the other vampires seemed nervous discussing her." Theron made the call on an antique rotary phone that one of the vampires produced from the tunnels, and the conversation was in a Slavic language Maya couldn't follow. When he hung up, his expression was grim. "She'll do it remotely," he said. "But she warns that the return of suppressed emotions will be intense and immediate. I'll need to be restrained." 4 of the strongest vampires volunteered Seraphine, the military-bearing vampire who introduced himself as Constantine, and 2 others named Dmitri and Isolde. Maya startled at the last name, and Theron's expression turned pained. "Different Isolde," he said quietly. "A common name in certain eras." They prepared a space in the center of the café, moving tables and chairs to create an open area. Theron removed his suit jacket and rolled up his shirt sleeves, and Maya saw old scars on his forearms, some silvered with age, some looking almost fresh despite being centuries old. He caught her looking. "Far from before," he said. "From when the pain was too much and I tried to make it stop in any way I could. Vampire bodies heal most wounds, but certain things leave marks." Maya took his hand, running her thumb gently over one of the scars. "You survived that pain. You'll survive this too." "Will I?" Theron's voice was barely a whisper. "Maya, I need you to promise me something. If I come back from this changed, if I'm not, you'll still be you," Maya interrupted. "Maybe a more complete you, maybe a messier you, but still you, and I'll be right here." At 1 a.m., with rain still hammering the windows and 40 vampires watching in tense silence, Marana performed the spell from thousands of miles away. Theron stood in the center of the café, surrounded by the 4 strongest court members, and Maya watched as he began to shake. It started subtly, a tremor in his hands, a tightness around his eyes. Then he gasped, as though struck, his knees buckling, and the 4 vampires moved to catch him and lower him to the floor. Theron's eyes went completely black, and he began to scream. The sound was pure anguish. 250 years of suppressed grief and rage and pain hitting him all at once. He thrashed against the vampires holding him, strong enough that even their supernatural strength struggled to contain him. Words poured from his mouth in a dozen languages, names, pleas, accusations, poetry in Middle English and what might have been Old French. Maya dropped to her knees beside him, heedless of the danger. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her, even though his eyes saw nothing but internal torment. "Theron," she said firmly, "come back. You're not there anymore. You're here. You're safe." He didn't respond, his body arching against the vampire's hold, and Maya could see the moment he slipped from grief into rage. His fangs extended fully for the first time since she had known him, and he snarled with a violence that made several watching vampires step back. "This is it," Casimir said from the sidelines, his voice carrying satisfaction. "This is what he becomes when he feels. An animal." "Shut up," Maya snapped, not taking her eyes off Theron. She leaned closer, her face inches from his, and spoke directly into his ear. "Listen to me. I know you're in pain. I know it feels like drowning, but you're not alone this time. I'm here. I'm real. And I need you to come back to me." She didn't know if it was her words or her proximity or simply the way her warm breath stirred his white hair, but Theron's thrashing slowed. His black eyes began to clear, dark brown returning in patches, and he focused on her face with an expression of such desperate longing that her heart cracked. "Maya," he breathed, her name a lifeline. "I'm here," she confirmed. "You're doing so well. Just a little longer. Let it pass through you instead of drowning in it." Theron shuddered violently, tears streaming down his pale face, tears tinged pink with blood, the way vampires wept. He was sobbing now instead of screaming, and Maya gathered him as close as the restraining vampires allowed, one hand stroking his hair, murmuring nonsense words of comfort while he broke apart and slowly, painfully began to reform. It took an hour of crying and shaking and occasionally thrashing when a particularly vicious memory surfaced, but gradually, incrementally, Theron calmed. His breathing, unnecessary for a vampire but maintained from old habit, steadied. His eyes stayed clear and focused on Maya's face, and finally he spoke in a voice scraped raw. "Let me go. I'm back. I'm myself." The four vampires released him cautiously, ready to restrain him again if needed, but Theron simply collapsed against Maya. She wrapped her arms around him fully, this ancient vampire king who had just survived an ordeal that would have destroyed most beings, and held him while the court watched in silence. "How do you feel?" Seraphine asked eventually, her tone clinically curious. Theron lifted his head from Maya's shoulder, and when he looked around the café at his assembled court, his expression was transformed. There was warmth there now, recognition, even affection when his gaze landed on certain individuals. "I feel everything," he said wonderingly. "I remember all of you, not just your names and roles, but who you are. Seraphine, you've been trying to get me to approve your art studio for 15 years, and I kept saying it wasn't practical, but I see now you need it the way humans need air." He turned to Constantine. "You've been patient with my tactical questions even when I asked the same thing repeatedly, because I couldn't retain emotional context for battle decisions. Thank you." He looked at each vampire in turn, offering similar observations, personal details he had noticed but not cared about before, now suddenly vital. When his gaze landed on Casimir, it was thoughtful rather than hostile. "You were right to worry," Theron said. "This version of me is different, more vulnerable, more likely to make decisions based on emotional factors rather than pure strategy." He stood slowly, helping Maya to her feet as he rose. "But I'm also more capable of genuine leadership now, of understanding what our people need, not just what keeps them in line." He addressed the full court. "I'm asking you to trust that this is an improvement, even when it's messy." Casimir stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're a fool," he said, but there was no heat in it anymore. "But perhaps that's what this court needs, a fool who cares." He moved toward the tunnel entrance, then paused. "The neutral ground is legitimate. I'll honor it, even if I don't agree with the reasoning behind it." Several other vampires followed Casimir into the tunnels, but far more stayed, clustering around Theron and Maya with questions and comments, and, in some cases, welcome. Seraphine clasped Maya's shoulder with surprising gentleness. "You did well, girl, better than most immortals would have managed." She looked at Theron. "She's good for you. Don't let this one go." "I don't intend to," Theron said, and the way he looked at Maya made her stomach flip. The court gradually dispersed over the next hour, vampires returning to the tunnels or emerging from the café to disappear into the rainy Seattle night. By 3 a.m., only Theron and Maya remained, surrounded by the debris of the evening push tables, scattered chairs, cups of untouched coffee going cold. Maya started to clean up, needing the familiar motions to process everything that had happened, but Theron caught her hand. "Leave it," he said. "Please. I need—" He stopped, seeming to search for words. "I need to talk to you, really talk, with nothing in the way anymore." They sat in his usual booth, facing each other across the scarred table, and Theron took both of Maya's hands in his cold ones. "I love you," he said simply. "I don't know if that's the spell breaking or if I've been falling for weeks and couldn't recognize it, but I know it now with absolute certainty. I love the way you make coffee like you're crafting art. I love that you wore green because it's practical, but also flattering. I love that you stood in front of 40 vampires and called us cowards for hiding in tunnels. I love—" his voice broke slightly. "I love that you held me together when I was falling apart and you didn't run even though you had every reason to." Maya's eyes were wet. "I love you too," she said. "I think I started loving you when you memorized my coffee order, because what kind of person does that? What kind of ancient vampire king pays that much attention to a random barista's personal drink?" She laughed, the sound watery. "And then you just kept showing up, kept being interesting and kind and genuine, and I fell a little more each time. You promised me a date," Theron said. "Dinner somewhere nice, you said." "I did," Maya smiled. "When are you taking me?" "Tomorrow night. Or technically tonight, given the hour. Theron lifted one of her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles with old-world courtliness. I'll pick you up at 8. Wear something formal. I've been alive for 6 centuries, and I know an excellent French restaurant that's been operating since the 1920s. The owners are vampires, so they're used to our kind, and they make the best duck confit in the Pacific Northwest. You're taking me to a vampire restaurant? Maya raised an eyebrow. I'm taking you to a restaurant that happens to be run by vampires. They serve human food, excellent human food, and they're discreet. Theron's expression turned more serious. Maya, this won't be easy. Being with me, I mean. There will always be dangers, rival territories, vampire politics, the simple fact that I'm an immortal predator, and you're human. Are you certain this is what you want? No, Maya said honestly. I'm terrified. This is insane by any reasonable measure, but I want it anyway. I want you. We'll figure out the rest. Theron pulled her around the table and into his lap, his arms wrapping around her with a possessiveness that should have been concerning but instead felt safe. Maya leaned into his cold chest, listening to the heart that beat so much slower than hers, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. I'll keep you safe, Theron murmured into her hair. I swear it on my existence. Nothing will harm you while I exist. Very dramatic, Maya said, but she was smiling. Very vampire king of you. I have 600 years of dramatic declarations saved up, Theron countered. You'll have to get used to it. They stayed like that until dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the café windows, and Theron reluctantly moved toward the tunnel entrance. At the threshold, he turned back. Thank you, he said, for giving me permission to feel again, for making my life worth living instead of just enduring. Thank you for memorizing my coffee order, Maya replied. Best meet cute ever. Theron's laugh followed him down into the darkness, and Maya locked the café behind him with a smile she couldn't suppress. The date was perfect. Theron arrived exactly on time, in a vintage car that probably cost more than Maya's student loans, dressed in a charcoal suit that made his white hair glow in the streetlights. He opened her door, offered his arm, and took her to Le Sang et la Rose, which did indeed serve the best duck confit Maya had ever tasted. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, her dreams of becoming a professor, his memories of watching cities grow from nothing, their shared love of Gothic literature. I knew Anne Radcliffe, Theron mentioned casually over dessert. She was brilliant, paranoid, but brilliant. She was convinced vampires were real, and I had to avoid her at parties. You're making that up, Maya accused. I swear I'm not. Ask Seraphine, she was there. Theron's grin was boyish and entirely human despite his fangs. Radcliffe once cornered me at a salon and demanded to know if I was undead. I told her I was just English. Maya laughed so hard she nearly choked on her wine, and Theron looked at her with such fondness that she had to look away, overwhelmed. They went on more dates after that, museums and bookstores and late-night walks through rain-soaked Seattle streets. Theron introduced her to the court slowly, carefully, making sure she built relationships with individual vampires rather than being overwhelmed by the group. Maya brought Sienna to the café one night when several younger vampires were visiting, and her co-worker adapted to the supernatural revelation with remarkable aplomb. I knew it, Sienna crowed. I called it. Vampire boyfriend. Technically, he's a vampire king, Maya corrected, and Theron looked simultaneously pleased and embarrassed by the title. 3 months into their relationship, Maya graduated with her literature degree. Theron attended the ceremony, sitting in the back where the sun streaming through the auditorium windows couldn't reach, and when Maya crossed the stage to receive her diploma, she could hear his applause even over the crowd. That evening, he gave her a first edition of Carmilla, an 1872 printing in pristine condition, and inside the cover he had written in elegant script, "For Maya, who saw the person behind the monster. With all my love, T." "This is worth thousands of dollars," Maya said, running her fingers reverently over the leather binding. "And you're worth infinitely more than that," Theron replied. "It's just a book, darling. Love it, read it, treasure it. That's what it's for." Maya kissed him then, in her tiny apartment with her graduation gown still draped over a chair, and felt the future unfold before them like a story still being written. The confrontation with Casimir's faction came 6 months after the spell broke. A group of 5 vampires traditionalists who had never accepted the neutral ground or Theron's transformation, attempted to challenge his rule through an ancient ritual of combat. It was Seraphine who brought the news to the café one rainy November evening. "They've invoked the right of contest," she said grimly. 5 against 1, traditional weapons only, to first submission or true death. "That's suicide," Maya said immediately. "Theron would never." "Theron has to accept," Seraphine interrupted. "It's law. Refusing would mean abdication." When Theron arrived an hour later, his expression was resigned. "You heard." "You're not doing this alone," Maya said. "There has to be a way. The law is clear." Theron took her hands, his grip gentle despite the tension in his frame. "I fight alone or I step down, and if I step down, Casimir claims kingship, and the first thing he'll do is revoke the neutral ground and eliminate any mortals who've learned of our existence." "So you're saying I'm leverage?" Maya's voice was flat. "I'm saying they've outmaneuvered us." Theron's jaw clenched. "But I'm faster than I was before the spell broke, stronger because I'm fighting for something beyond territory or pride. I can win this." The contest took place in the tunnels beneath the city, in a vast chamber that had once been a pneumatic mail sorting facility. The full court assembled to witness, along with Maya, who Theron refused to leave behind despite the danger. "If I'm fighting for you, you should see it," he said simply. The 5 challengers entered the arena armed with silver-edged swords and stakes carved from blessed wood. They moved as a unit, coordinated and lethal, and for the first few minutes of combat, Maya thought Theron would lose. He was 1 against 5, forced to dodge and parry without managing any real offense, and she could see blood staining his white shirt where blades had found their marks. Then something shifted. Theron stopped fighting defensively and went on the attack, moving with speed that turned him into a white blur. He disarmed the first challenger in seconds, broke the sword arm of the second, and drove the third back with a series of strikes that rang through the chamber like bells. The final 2 tried to flank him, but Theron seemed to anticipate their movements, spinning between them and using their own momentum to send them sprawling. Within minutes, all 5 challengers were on the ground, disarmed and injured, but alive. Theron stood over them with a captured sword at his side, breathing hard despite not needing air, and his voice carried to every corner of the chamber. "I could kill you," he said. "Ancient law gives me that right, but I choose mercy, because that's what being a king who feels means. You'll submit now, or you'll face not execution, but exile, banishment from this territory and all territories that honor our treaties. Choose," the challengers submitted. Even Casimir, watching from the crowd, inclined his head in acknowledgement of Theron's victory. Later, in the café with Maya tending to his wounds with a first aid kit that seemed absurd given his supernatural healing, Theron was quiet. "I was afraid," he admitted finally. "During the fight. Afraid I'd lose, afraid I'd die, afraid I'd fail you. Before the spell broke, I would have fought with cold efficiency. But today, I fought with everything I am, including the fear, and somehow that made me stronger." "Fear means you have something to lose," Maya said, taping gauze over a particularly deep cut on his shoulder. "That's not weakness. That's what makes victory matter." Theron caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Marry me." Maya froze. "What?" "Marry me." Theron's dark eyes were absolutely serious. "I know it's complicated. I know I can't give you children or grow old with you or have a conventional life. But I can give you centuries of devotion, endless nights of conversation, and a love that survived 600 years of existence to find you. Marry me, Maya Patterson. Let me spend whatever time we have making you happy." Maya's eyes filled with tears. "You're supposed to have a ring for this." "I have 12 rings in my quarters," Theron said, "from various centuries and cultures. I'll let you choose whichever one you like, or we can design something new together. But I needed to ask now, in this moment, so you know that after facing my worst fear tonight, you're still my greatest certainty." "Yes," Maya said, and then louder. "Yes, you ridiculous romantic vampire. I'll marry you." Theron pulled her into his lap and kissed her until she was breathless. And somewhere in the tunnels below, the vampire court erupted in applause they could hear, even through brick and earth. They married 3 months later in the café on a February evening with rain, drumming on the windows, and both vampire and human guests in attendance. Maya wore a simple white dress and carried a bouquet of dark red roses that Seraphine had grown in her newly approved art studio. Theron wore a midnight blue suit with silver embroidery, And when he said his vows in front of 40 vampires and 24 humans, including Maya's bewildered but supportive family, his voice never wavered. "I vow to love you through every sunrise I cannot see and every night we share," he said. "I vow to protect you, cherish you, and never take for granted the gift of your mortal life beside my immortal one. I vow to remember every detail of every moment we have together, because you taught me that details matter, that care matters, that love is found in the small things as much as the grand gestures." Maya cried through her own vows, and when they kissed as the officiant pronounced them married, the café erupted in cheers that mingled vampire and human voices into something entirely new. The years that followed were the happiest of Maya's life. She took a position teaching Victorian literature at the university, and her evening classes allowed her to keep the same nocturnal schedule as Theron. The café remained neutral ground, becoming a meeting place where mortal and vampire could interact safely, and Maya took over partial ownership, expanding the menu and hosting literary events that drew both communities. Theron ruled his territory with a compassion that had been absent before, settling disputes with wisdom that acknowledged emotional context alongside strategic necessity. Under his leadership, the Pacific Northwest Court became known for its progressive policies and its protection of mortals, and other territories began to follow suit. On their 5th anniversary, Theron took Maya back to the booth where they'd had their first real conversation. He had recreated that evening exactly same time, same rain, same black coffee for him, and complicated order for her. "5 years ago, I memorized your coffee order and didn't understand why," he said. "Today I can list 1,000 other things about you. The way you annotate books in 3 different colors of ink, how you hum while you're grading papers, the specific angle of your smile when you're proud of a student's progress, the way you still get nervous before meeting new vampires even though half the court considers you their friend." "That's very sweet," Maya said. "But I know you. What's the real reason we're recreating this night?" Theron smiled, and it was the warm, genuine expression he wore only for her now. "Because I wanted to mark the moment when my life truly began, not when I was turned 600 years ago, not when I became king 300 years ago. But when I saw you make yourself a complicated coffee drink and smile because it came out right." He took her hand across the table. "You saved me, Maya. Not from enemies or political threats, but from myself. From an eternity of not feeling, not caring, not living in any way that mattered. You gave me back my life, and I wanted to say thank you for that. Again. Forever." Maya leaned across the table and kissed him, tasting coffee and rain and the future stretching out before them. Outside, Seattle continued its endless drizzle, the city lights reflecting in wet pavement, and inside the sanctuary, a vampire king and his mortal wife celebrated the anniversary of the day love taught him to remember. They had decades together before Maya's mortal life began to show its limits, and Theron offered her the choice of turning 3 times across those years. Each time, Maya refused gently. "I want to live this life as myself," she explained. "Fully human, fully finite, it makes every moment more precious." "I'll lose you," Theron said, and even after all his years of feeling again, the pain in his voice was sharp. "You'll grieve me," Maya corrected, "and it will hurt terribly. But you'll survive it because you've learned how to feel without being destroyed by feeling, and you'll keep living, keep ruling, keep making the world better. That's the gift of what we've built together. You know how to carry love even when loss comes." When Maya died at 73, peacefully in her sleep with Theron holding her hand, the vampire king grieved openly and deeply. He closed the café for a month, and the court gave him space to mourn without judgment. He cried blood-tinged tears and raged at the unfairness of mortal lifespans, and sat in their empty apartment surrounded by her books and her annotated lesson plans and the ridiculous collection of coffee mugs she had accumulated. But he survived it. He processed the grief instead of running from it, leaned on Seraphine and Constantine and the other vampires who had become genuine friends, and eventually he returned to his duties. He reopened the café and maintained it as neutral ground, hiring new baristas and making sure Maya's legacy of connection between mortal and immortal worlds continued. And every year on the anniversary of the night he had memorized her coffee order, Theron sat in their booth and made her complicated drink exactly right, letting himself remember not with pain but with gratitude for the woman who had taught him that 600 years of existence was nothing compared to one lifetime of love. The café remained open for another 200 years under vampire protection, a testament to the barista who had faced down an ancient court and the king who had learned to care again. And if sometimes, on rainy Seattle evenings, patrons claimed to see a white-haired vampire and a dark-haired woman sharing coffee in the corner booth, smiling at each other like they had all the time in the world, well, some love stories endure beyond mortality, written in memory and devotion, and the simple act of remembering someone's order after a single visit.